Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
We've often been told that when we're in public, two subjects should never be discussed, religion and politics. It has long been the complaint of religious groups that getting public discourse via the media is difficult. Antagonism is high. The religion beat for many journalists is not seen as a real beat. And religious groups are suspicious of snooping reporters, having seen what happens when unethical religion and unfriendly media clashes. The foremost questions seem to be what is news and how to get in the news without committing sin. Hello, I'm Valerie Bridgman Davis, Outreach Pastor of Sure Foundation Fellowship and your host for today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Today, here to discuss the relationship between the media and religion, we have Richard Miner, the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Austin for the Catholic Church, and David Lowery, Managing Editor of the Austin American Statesman. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
It's good to have you here.
Nice to be here, Valerie.
Well, this is kind of a big subject for most of our viewers because that is the big question, how to get in the media without committing sin. And David, I'm going to let you start. Austin Statesman does have religion coverage, and people have often said maybe it's not enough, but would you talk a little bit about what you do?
Sure, I'll tell you what we have. We have a religion page every Saturday that's in the lifestyle section. We have in our neighbor sections, which come out on Thursday, there's also a religion page, which I think you're familiar with, that lists all kinds of religious activities. In addition to that, we also have religion coverage, and that is whether a church is making news or whether someone important like the Pope is coming to town or whatever. We will get that covered too because we have people who do concentrate on religion coverage. So we have several vehicles for religion news.
But you don't have anybody at the paper who is called, quote, a religion reporter.
Well, Sarah Burden McClure on the neighbor sections is the religion writer, and she has that title. And we have Carlos Greth, who is our religion expert, but he doesn't have the title religion writer yet.
You've been here in Austin about 6 months.
Yes.
You came here from?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Tell us a little bit about the coverage there.
Well, in Atlanta, the coverage is very extensive. We had on the staff of the Journal-Constitution, which is a much larger paper than the Austin paper, several times larger. We had 2 religion writers. One concentrated on your normal church activities, the listings, a feature a week, and the Saturday religion page, which was very similar to what we have in Austin. We also had Gus Niebuhr, who was the writer who covered religion issues as an issue. He would cover the Southern Baptist Convention political fights. He would cover the Catholic Church's fights with Archbishop Hunthausen in Seattle. We did a whole lot of coverage of religion as an issue and as a larger aspect of life in America. So it was a very extensive type of coverage.
And David, you specialize in trying to get the media to cover the Catholic Church. I mean, Richard, you specialize in trying to get the Catholic Church in the news. Is that right?
Well, I'm the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Austin, and of course, the Catholic Diocese covers Central Texas, 27 counties, 250,000 plus Catholics, 125 churches. So it's a large area. And my job, there are 2 portions to it. One is internal communication within the church itself, and the other is external, dealing with media and public relations within the community. And basically, my job with the external communications is dealing with the newspapers, the television, and the radio stations, their reporters, and their people to have them show the church in its best light, naturally.
Sure. What I wanted to ask you about what you do, how long have you been doing what you do?
Well, I've been with the diocese here a little over 3 years in Austin. I've done extensive work in the media, in broadcast, television broadcasting. That's what initially brought me to Austin, was the television broadcast. Since then, I've been working with publications with the church and now with the diocese.
David, one of the biggest questions that people from the religious community have is, what is news? One of the things that they hear is, this isn't news, and they keep trying, and they don't know what news is. So could you describe what news is to the media?
Sure, I'll try. I break it down into 3 separate categories. There is news of your individual congregation, your individual church. That is what I would consider neighborhood news, and that would go in the neighborhood sections that we were talking about earlier. That's if someone is speaking at your church who's notable, if you're having some activity that's out of the ordinary, and that's where that kind of news goes and belongs, because it's pretty specialized. There is news that churches probably more often than not don't want, and that's when, by virtue of their actions, they break into the front page or the city-state sections, whether they're in a controversy over moving a church, whether they're in a controversy over selling land or buying land, whether they are filing for bankruptcy because they can't make their mortgage payments or whatever, like anybody else. That kind of news is out there to be done as we know about it, and we deem that it's worth covering. Again, that's probably not what people are talking about when they say they can't get in the newspaper. The third category is the larger aspect of tenets of a religion, aspects of it, like the Southern Baptists are going through right now over a fight of control, really, between the fundamentalists and the more liberal elements of that very large Protestant congregation. Those kinds of issue-oriented news stories we go after from time to time. But in terms of how you get into the paper, those are the 3 different ways you can get there.
And as you say, people probably don't want to make the front page news, considering what that would mean.
Most of the time, that's right. I would think that when the Pope came to San Antonio, that's the kind of front page news everybody was glad to have. Maybe Hyde Park Baptist Church would not rather have front page stories about their particular neighborhood squabble, but those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about.
Would you both talk, and maybe you could start, Richard, about the religious climate in Austin, your perception of what is newsworthy, how the community even receives news about the church, not just the Catholic Church, but the Christian church, or even other religions, the Jews?
Well, I feel that that there's a lot of activity within the church community, the total church community in Austin. I'm talking about the Baptists, the Catholic, the Jewish, and all faiths. They have a real commitment to working in Austin, working in various ways. Now, on behalf of the Catholic Church, definitely they have immigration groups working with the immigration. They have hospital clinics set up that have been set up by Caritas Clinic. Initially, Caritas was started by the Catholic Church. Now it's become a universal organization. St. Vincent de Paul, these are all Catholic organizations that I'm talking about, but they definitely relate to the total community. They service the total community. They don't turn anyone away. We have total alcoholic setups where we take care of alcoholics. We take care of drugs, people on drugs. We have areas of general concern for the entire public. And we work with other church groups on many of these concerns, too.
I'm smiling because I know why you're in PR now. David, would you talk a little bit about your perception of the religious community here? I know this is a little unfair because you've only been here 6 months.
That's right. It's a loaded question because I have only been here 6 months. And I couldn't really tell you that I have a hard and fast perception of the religious community. What I could tell you is that any community I've been in has a religious presence. And I think this one's no different, just from what I've seen in 6 months here. Like you mentioned, I know that the Catholic Social Services is doing a lot of things, and with immigration, and I think that a lot of the festivals you see, a lot of the involvement in the weekends are often church-sponsored. So I think there is a general interest in Austin of a very small c Catholic nature, you know, a general kind of religious nature, ecumenical, if you will. I think it's out there. But I think that's probably true of most communities in the country. This one is a very intellectual community. It's got a very high standard of education. It's got a pretty high standard of income across the board. And I think those things make it a very interesting and vital community for the religion, for the religious, and the churches and the religion groups to check into, because it's out there to be tapped.
You know, I was going to say, dealing with the media, the newspaper, radio, television, it's probably, I think all churches have a difficulty in finding an area that interests these people. And I think that somehow maybe the religious groups do not understand the media's job, and the media does not understand all about the religious group, whether it be Catholic or whatever. And so therefore I think that, you know, like your newspaper, you say you don't have a religious report or a religious editor right now. And I think the city is big enough for that. I think that, you know, we dedicate
well, but
12
in all
or
fairness,
14
he
pages.
did say they do have somebody covering religion.
Yeah,
Richard.
but
We
we
shouldn't say it quite like that.
Well, we do dedicate 12, 14 pages of sports news sometimes.
Sure.
And certainly there are as many religious people in the town as there are sports followers.
That's probably true. I think if you looked at a readership survey, you would not find religion news very high on the scale of what people read every day in a newspaper, or even what they want to read. I think that's going to be pretty low on the totem pole in terms of generally what you want out of your daily newspaper and your 30 minutes a day to read it. But I don't disagree that there's a place for religion writing in a newspaper and for religious coverage in a newspaper. I think there is. And we have talked very seriously about having a full-time religion writer at the paper, and I'd be very surprised if at the end of the year we didn't have one. On the other hand, you have to balance that, and to use sports is probably not the best idea, because sports readerships were quite high, and maybe that's not quite fair to the reader.
I hate for the sports page, so I can't say too much about that, except for you did say, you were talking a little bit, and I want you to follow what you were saying about the readership here, because there is a question of whether or not people really want a certain type of news, and my personal perceptions, albeit not scientific, are that people are interested in a different level in what's happening in the religion community around them.
Do you think that they're interested in a narrow, small level, in other words, within their own congregation or their own religious affiliation, or do you think that they're interested in the very larger aspect of religious life?
Because this is a community of educated people, my perception, and again, this is all unscientific here, is that people are on a broader area even than their own local congregation interested, because I'm not Southern Baptist, but I follow with much interest what's happening with the Southern Baptist Church. I'm not Catholic, and yet I follow with much interest what's going on, especially because of the influx of Hispanics into Texas, and what that means with regard to influx. Usually with regard to religion, that means an influx of Roman Catholics or Catholics. And then what the church is doing with regard to that influx, being non-Catholic, is interesting to me. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, we have done scientific studies of readership, and
help me out.
In fact, we're right in the midst of one now for the Austin American Statesman. I don't have all the figures back on that yet. We have had preliminary meetings with what the results were. However, we just finished one in Atlanta that was started shortly after I left that paper to come here. But I was back there 2 weeks ago for a presentation of what that showed. And it was quite interesting. I mean, it's most of the readership surveys of newspapers in the country in major markets, of which Austin has got to be considered one. It's international news and national news as tops, and then local community news as second, and then you're going to run into sports. You'll get down to gardening and a whole lot of other things before anyone will say religion news in a newspaper is important to me. The question that's unanswered in that is that because they traditionally don't get it in the newspaper, and so they're not expecting it and not used to it.
Well, you know, I'd like to make a comment on that. I think that the Austin American Statesman does a tremendous job on religious news coverage. They do incorporate religious news within the news of the newspaper, which I think is important. I think it's very important.
It's not segregated in a religious ghetto, which we used to call it.
It's very important that it becomes a part of the news.
Mainstream.
Whether it is state, local, or national news. And they do treat it that way. And I think that's a good way of reacting to it. What I was referring to was a religious beat, which in this town we do have a large religious community. We do have the Metropolitan Ministry, the Austin Metropolitan Ministries, which is a large group of congregation of all faiths, and they're doing a lot of things. They're doing a lot of interesting news-making events together. And I think ecumenism as a whole is a very important thing within the community.
As a separate story, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think that with this group, with the group that is presenting this television show, that they make news every week. If the audience were there to watch the show, there is news there. And what we're talking about, I think that that's important, that people hear the relationship between the media, between religious groups.
Well, part of it is getting back to the whole issue of antagonism, perceived antagonism, that I worked as a reporter for a while, and I know that there were times when I went to cover stories where I was received with suspicion because I was a reporter covering something religion related. So I don't know how to talk about this antagonism between the media and the religious community. Why is that? Can either of you think of why that might be?
Well, I don't find a whole lot of that going on, because in my presentation to the media, I try not to write a news release that does the job for the reporter. If I'm going to try to get the media to cover a story, I present a story idea or a picture idea and say, hey, I've got an idea for you, and let them take it and run with it.
But my gut says that's the exception, Richard.
And
You're the exception.
I find that works real well to let, you know, I'm not paid to write the story. The reporter's paid to write that story.
Well, clearly, Richard is very savvy about the media and how it works, and you're knowledgeable, and you seem to have a very good, strong grip on what to do and how to do it. I think what Valerie's referring to, if she went to a congregation to cover a story, you could be met with individually with some animosity. Certainly, it depends on the story you're covering. Certainly, Jim Baker's group didn't like to see the reporters come down to, Heritage USA to cover that story. That's not so much a problem of religious antagonism. That's just the individual story that's the problem.
Well, I think that goes back to the church and to the media person for that church too. Naturally, there are going to be stories that break that you don't want to talk about.
Sure. Well,
but you have to face those stories and be honest with the people and say, okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it as reasonable as we can. You know?
Well, you have the very best attitude about how to deal with the press. Undeniably, that's the way to do it. You don't run from it. You don't try to fool it. You don't lie to it. It's just too pervasive. It won't work.
You can't run away.
If you stand there and say, I can't tell you certain things, but I'll tell you what I can tell you, or here's the way I see it, or whatever, I think you get a better response and a better reaction. But I'm still not certain you two are talking about
Well,
the same
I don't think
thing.
we're talking about the same thing. I'm talking about just the local feature.
Right.
Where you go to do a local color piece on a local church, a local activity in a church, and it's met with, what are you up to?
Well, to defend Richard's
who's saying
perception, though,
Right.
I haven't heard, again, I've been here 6 months, but we have done 2 religion features a week. And whether you think that's enough or not, there are a lot of people that would like that kind of coverage. That's 2 full pages of news a week devoted to religion in the Austin American Statesman. And I haven't heard, it hasn't come back to me, your reporter weaseled his way in here, or I wasn't presented with a fair picture, or even that you didn't do a very good job of this.
Oh,
and
no.
both of you know that there have been a lot of stories, and
Right.
Carlos has done them on counseling before you can go into the ministry, the Catholic story you were talking about earlier. We do a lot of it, and believe me, I would hear it if there was
No,
a lot of
I don't
animosity.
mean that the church comes back and says to you, the managing editor, oh, that reporter was really lousy. But when the reporter goes, the initial reception is one of suspicion, even if they afterwards say, oh, that was fair.
But if you were not,
Yeah.
if you were not a person who was in frequent contact with the reporter or the media, it is a bit off-putting, I think. I mean, both of you,
right.
you've been a reporter, you've both worked with them most of your careers, I suspect. That it doesn't scare you or bother you. You can handle it with aplomb. But I think somebody out there who only sees the TV cameras
Right.
or the newspaper on their door, but never has to sit there and answer a question from a reporter, can be put in a defensive position instantly by the very fact that what they say is going to be read by 250,000 people.
How can we make the religious community media literate?
I think Richard's got a very good start on it. It's a matter of taking the people that are going to be faced with a reporter of any kind, radio, TV, or newspaper, and counseling them a little bit, talking to them about, here's what you do. There's nothing to be afraid of. The worst thing you can do is lie. The second worst thing you can do is hide. And just be truthful, be forthright, and you don't have to say anything you don't want to say.
It's difficult sometimes when a reporter calls and he asks a question and you don't know where he's coming from, right? But that's a part of being a reporter.
Does he know something I don't know?
Yeah. Tell me about it. Can I call you back in a minute or two?
That's not a bad response, actually.
No, I'm losing
what I would
control here. In all fairness, what I had in the back of my mind was a story that I read in the paper, whose name will not be mentioned on this show, about an organization that maybe was undercover. And they used an example in the article of a member of the organization that had been cleared of all charges, had never been convicted of the crime that the article was talking about. And when people see things like that in the paper or hear it on the news and then later you come back, I could see why people would be a bit antagonized.
It's hard for me to answer. That's a little bit too
no, I wouldn't,
speculative.
Yeah. I wouldn't expect you to do that.
Well, I don't want to get defensive.
I wouldn't expect you to do that. I'm just saying that there are times when it appears to me, and again, this is all unscientific on my part, but also coming from both sides of the coins. I have been both media and advocate for religious groups, and having been on both sides of the coins, I know how difficult it can be for the religious person trying to explain to a reporter who has no knowledge sometimes, and that's rare. Because Carlos, for instance, for the Statesman, is very knowledgeable. But something as simple as saying to a reporter, there's a difference between Church of Christ and United Church of Christ, and they go, I don't know, you know. Not that that has happened, but what I'm saying is I know that that does happen.
Well, it certainly has happened, I'm sure, in many places and many times. There's a need to inform reporters and help them understand a story. I have had to deal with reporters in my job here. I had people call me, and it was kind of an unusual situation for me to be in, too. And I would frequently find myself saying, now, wait a minute, let me make sure you understand this. You know, here's what I'm saying. And explaining something like the difference in the Church of Christ and the United Church of Christ, or the United Methodist Church, or another synod of the Lutheran Church. And it's something that needs to be explained there. And if a reporter's covering City Hall, it's no different.
Right.
You have to tell him what this budget is. You can't assume that somebody's going to know all that.
Good, yeah. Well, we're coming down to the end of our time here. Would either of you like to make one final stand?
I just think that from what I've seen, that the religion community and the Austin American Statesman are getting along pretty good. But I did come from a much different situation in Atlanta, where religion and the newspaper, while not at odds, were often on different tracks.
Well, I think yes, that the media does well for religion in Austin. I think there's a long way for the media to learn more about the different religious groups, and I think the religious groups have a lot to learn about the media too, and how to handle them. And I think it's a two-way street, and I think that that we're working in that general direction, and I think that it's a good thing that's happening.
Well, there was a real good comparison to when the Exxon oil spill occurred in Alaska, to the business world having to deal with the press a lot of them for the first time. And it was just like you were saying, they had a lot to learn about how to deal with the press, and the press had a lot to learn about how business works. And that's a constant in this business.
Well, perhaps we will all learn how to get in the news without committing sin, and perhaps the news media will consider something other than sin newsworthy.
I'm going to argue that we do.
Okay. As we end today's discussion, I would like to thank you, David, and thank you also, Richard, for your input and your insights. On behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, I'm Valerie Bridgman Davis, thanking you for joining us and inviting you to be with us next week at this same time. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.